The morning I freed that young one from the log boom, I was 21 years old, and I thought I had seen everything the South Fork of the Coquille River could throw at a man. By that same night, with something standing at the edge of our camp that made the crickets go silent and the horses in the corral press themselves against the far fence in a pack, I understood I had not seen anything at all. I'm 71 years old now. That was 50 years ago this past July, and I have never told this story to a single person outside of my wife Connie, who heard it on our third date and married me anyway. I am telling it now because I am old enough that keeping it doesn't serve any purpose I can still identify. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. I grew up in Roseburg, Oregon, the second of three sons born to a man who ran a small engine repair shop on Garden Valley Boulevard and a woman who taught fourth grade at Hillcrest Elementary for 31 years. Roseburg sits in the Umpqua Valley, and the timber business shaped everything about that town in the same quiet, total way that water shapes the ground beneath it. You don't notice it happening until you look at the result and realize there was never going to be any other outcome. My father fixed chainsaws and skidder engines and portable mill equipment, and the men who brought him that work were loggers and timber crews and small operation sawyers who worked the Douglas County hills. I grew up knowing the names of equipment before I knew the names of most countries on a map. I knew what a bucker did and what a faller did and what a yarder was and why the difference between a good choker setter and a bad one could get somebody killed. That knowledge was just the air we breathed. I went to Roseburg High School and graduated in 1971 without any particular distinction. I was not a bad student and not a good one. I was a student who was present, which in that time and place and at that age was more or less all that was required of you. My older brother Dennis had gone to work at the Roseburg Forest Products Mill out of high school and seemed content with it, and for about 3 months after graduation, I assumed I was heading the same direction. My father did not push me either way. He had a practical man's understanding of the fact that you don't know what you're suited to until you've tried a few things, and he was willing to let me take some time finding out. What found me first was water. I had spent my summers since the age of 12 fishing every piece of the North Umpqua and its tributaries that I could reach on a bicycle or eventually a borrowed truck, and somewhere in those years I developed a relationship with moving water that I have never been able to fully account for in practical terms. I just felt better near it, calmer, more like whatever version of myself was actually real rather than the version performing the daily business of being a young man in a town where young men were expected to have a direction. When I heard through my father's shop that the Hunter Timber Company was looking for a hand on their Coquille River boom operation, a man had quit on them in June, and they were short going into the big summer push. I drove to Myrtle Point on a Wednesday morning in late June of 1972 and introduced myself to the operations manager, a lean, taciturn man named Oscar Webb, and told him I was a fast learner and good in water. Oscar looked at me for about 10 seconds and said he'd give me 2 weeks to prove I wasn't going to kill myself, and if I made it through 2 weeks, he'd put me on the regular crew. I made it through 2 weeks. The first thing you learn as a boom man, and the thing that determines whether you're going to last in the work, is that the river is not interested in your schedule or your confidence or your intentions. The river has its own agenda, and that agenda is to get to the ocean, and everything in the river, the logs, the debris, the current patterns, the boils and back eddies that form around rocks and bottom structure, is organized around that single purpose. Your job is to work within that purpose, not against it. A man who tries to fight the river doesn't last long on floating logs. A man who learns to read the river and move with it can do things that look impossible to someone watching from the bank. I am not a naturally graceful person. On flat ground, I am adequate. On a ladder, I am fine. On a floating log 12 inches in diameter and moving water with a 10-foot pike pole in my hands and the knowledge that falling between the logs might very well kill me, I turned out to be And this surprised me as much as anyone, quite good. The reflexes were there. The weight-shifting instinct was there. After about a week on the water, the constant low-level calculation that novice boom men have to consciously perform. Is this log stable? Which way is it likely to roll? Where do I put this foot? Or to started happening below the level of thought. The way riding a bicycle happens below the level of thought, and once it was automatic, I could start paying attention to other things. The patterns of the boom, how the incoming logs stacked, the behavior of the water around the perimeter chains, the particular personality of the South Fork, which was different from any other water I had fished, different in mood and tempo and in how it handled the things floating on it. The man who taught me most of what I know about boom work was Jilly. His full name was Clarence Gilmore, and he had been working boom operations on the Coquille County rivers since approximately 1945, which meant that by the time I met him in the summer of 1972, he had been doing this for 27 years and had no illusions left about any part of it. He was 61 that summer, white-haired, with a face that the river and the sun and the cold mornings had worked on until it looked more like carved bark than skin. He was not warm by most definitions of the word. He did not encourage. He did not explain himself. What he did was demonstrate, and if you were paying attention, which he assumed you were, you learned. If you were not paying attention, Jilly did not repeat himself. He simply moved on, and the knowledge he had intended to pass along went with him. He taught me the sound a log makes when it is about to roll by using it in a sentence once. He said, "You hear that?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That means it rolls left." And then he moved on to the next log, and I noted that specific sound with every neuron I had, and I never stood on a rolling left log again without knowing it was coming. That is how Jilly taught. A single demonstration, a single observation, and the assumption that you would integrate it immediately into your working knowledge. It was the most efficient pedagogy I have ever experienced, and also the least forgiving. And I have thought about it many times since when I have been the one doing the teaching. I went home to Roseburg at the end of that first summer in 1972 with muscles I hadn't known I had, and a left shoulder that ached when the weather changed in the beginning of what I can only describe as a relationship with the South Fork that was different from anything I had with any other piece of water. I had fished rivers. I knew rivers as places you stood in or stood beside and read for fish. The South Fork had become more than that. I knew it as a workplace, which means I knew it the way you know the layout of a building you spend 8 hours a day in, not as a scenic backdrop, but as a physical reality with specific features in specific locations that mattered for specific reasons. I knew where the water ran fast and where it pooled. I knew which bends held debris and which ran clean. I knew the sound the boom made at different water levels, the chain tension shifting as the river rose or fell, and I knew the smell of the place in the morning fog versus the smell in the afternoon when the sun had been working on the bark tannins all day. That knowledge felt earned, and the prospect of going back to it the following summer had a pull to it, the pull of a place where I already knew what I was. My name is Dale Morris. I was a boom man on the South Fork of the Coquille River in Coos County, Oregon, from the summer of 1972 until the early 1980s, when the industry mechanized enough that they didn't need men walking logs in caulk boots anymore. If you don't know what a boom man does, the simplest way I can put it is this. When a logging crew cuts timber on a hillside, those logs have to get to the mill somehow. On the South Fork in those years, a good portion of them came down the river. The logs went in the water upstream, floated down to a holding area called a boom, a square or rectangular enclosure formed by heavy logs chained end to end. And our job was to get out there on the water, on top of those logs, and sort them, brand them, grade them, organize them.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
On floating logs, that was the job in its plainest form. You wore caulk boots, boots with rows of short metal spikes in the sole that bit into wet bark, and you carried a pike pole, which is a long wooden handle with a sharp metal spike on the end and a hook just below it. You used the spike end to push logs and the hook to pull them. You learned to read the water, to feel which way a log was going to roll before it rolled, to shift your weight without thinking about it the way a man on a bicycle doesn't think about balance. If you fell in, which every boom man did eventually, you went in between logs that weighed 10 tons each and were trying to come together on you. You learned not to fall in. You learned it fast or you found other work. The South Fork of the Coquille runs through some of the heaviest timber country in southern Oregon. The valley is narrow and steep, the kind of country where the ridges on both sides block the sun until mid-morning and cut it off again by mid-afternoon. And in between you've got Douglas fir and Port Orford cedar, so tall and so dense that standing under them feels like standing in a cathedral that's been there since before anyone thought to name cathedrals. There were Roosevelt elk in those drainages, bears, bobcat, cougar. The road into camp followed the river for the last 12 miles. And in the rainy season, it was the kind of road that reminded you every mile that the mountain tolerated your presence rather than welcomed it. The camp itself sat about 20 miles up the South Fork from the town of Powers, which was itself not what most people would call a city. Powers had maybe 400 people, a school, a thriftway grocery, a tavern called the Buckhorn that smelled like pine resin and cigarette smoke, and a mill that employed about a third of the men in the county. Our camp was 3 bunkhouses, a cookhouse, a tool shed, and a small equipment barn, all perched on a flat bench above the river where a side creek came in and created enough level ground to set something down without it sliding into the water. The camp had a diesel generator that ran from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, and after 10 it was kerosene lamps and whatever moonlight came down through the canopy. There were 22 men in camp that summer, counting the feller bunchers working up on the ridge line and the yarder crew that worked the cables and our boom crew of 4 down at the water. The foreman was a man named Bud Fletcher, who had been working in the Coos County timber since 1953 and ran camp the way a good foreman should, which meant he was fair but did not explain himself twice. Bud was 51 that summer, lean and weather-darkened, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood we were handling. He had a low tolerance for men who complained and a high tolerance for men who worked, and I fell into the second category from the start, which is why he kept me on after my first season. My bunkmate was a young man named Wayne Pruitt, 19 that summer and newly arrived from Roseburg looking for work after his father's hardware store closed. Wayne was quick and funny and afraid of nothing he could see, which would prove to be a relevant quality later. We had been working together for about 6 weeks by the time the events of that July happened, long enough that I trusted him the way you trust a man whose reflexes you have watched under pressure. The other 2 men on the boom crew were Earl Sanderson and a quiet older fellow everyone called Jilly, which was short for Gilmore, but nobody used the long form. Earl was 34, had worked boom operations all the way from the Coquille up to the Siuslaw, and knew more about reading floating timber than anyone I'd met before or since. He could look at a jam log from 20 feet away and tell you which end to hit first and in which direction, and with how much force. Jilly had been doing it so long he had stopped counting the years and seemed almost to have grown naturally out of the river itself. He spoke about 6 words an hour, and all of them were worth hearing. The summer of 1974 was my 3rd season on the South Fork, which meant I was no longer the new man who needed watching. That status had passed to Wayne Pruitt, who had arrived in June, looking like someone had recently told him that confidence and actual skill were different things, and he hadn't quite processed the information yet. Wayne was from Roseburg, the same as me, and we had a passing acquaintance from the same social territory. He was a few years younger, had played on the baseball team at his school when I was at mine, and we'd run into each other at enough Friday night gatherings around Douglas County to be comfortable with each other from the start. When I found out he was joining the Hainer crew for the summer, I told Bud I'd take him on as my bunkmate, which was an act of either generosity or self-interest, depending on how you looked at it. A nervous new man in a separate bunk is a problem for everybody. A nervous new man in your bunk is a problem you can manage. Wayne turned out to be a good hand, not naturally gifted the way I had apparently been. He had the consciously performing stage for longer than most, the visible calculation on his face every time he made a move on the logs, but he was physically capable and he listened, and he did not have the particular flaw that gets boom men hurt, which is overconfidence. A man who knows he doesn't know what he's doing is safer on floating logs than a man who thinks he does. Wayne knew his limits and respected them, and by midsummer he was covering the downstream section of the boom with a steadiness that let Earl and me work the more technical upstream end without worrying about what was happening behind us. Our cook that summer was a man named Fletcher Dodd, no relation to Bud Fletcher, the foreman, except that they had the same last name in a similar manner, which is to say minimal tolerance for nonsense and total mastery of their respective domains. Fletcher Dodd had been a Navy cook and then a restaurant cook in Coos Bay, and then a logging camp cook for the last 12 years of his working life, and he operated the cookhouse at our camp with a foreman sensibility, with clear expectations, no explanations, and the absolute confidence that comes from knowing you are the indispensable center of a larger operation. He was 63 that summer, built like a man who had spent his whole career around food and taken full advantage of the access, and he could produce a hot breakfast for 22 men in under an hour, starting from a cold stove, which is a skill that most people who have never done it significantly underestimate. Fletcher Dodd's biscuits were the social currency of that camp, not his only notable output, and the man did things with a cast iron skillet and a haunch of elk that a hunter had traded him for 2 seasons of packed lunches. But the biscuits were what men talked about, light without being insubstantial, with a slight tang from the buttermilk he drove to Powers to buy fresh every Saturday, served with a gravy that he made from rendered bacon fat and whatever dried spices he kept in a tin box that nobody was allowed to examine. Eating those biscuits at 5:30 in the morning with the generator running and the fog on the river and the day's work ahead of you was one of those small, concentrated pleasures that the body remembers even when the mind has moved on to other things. I am 71 years old, and I can still taste them. Evenings in camp ran on a slower clock. After the dinner dishes were done and the cookhouse had been set for the next morning, the men spread out into the patterns that camp life develops over a season. The card players to bunkhouse 2, the readers and the quiet men to various corners, the outdoor contingent to the bunkhouse steps or the flat above the river if the weather was good. Bud Fletcher did not participate in the card games, which was a standard foreman's choice. You don't play cards with the men you're going to have to make hard calls about. But he would sometimes sit on the equipment barn steps with a cup of coffee and a pipe and watch the light go out of the valley. And if you ended up sitting near him during those hours, you got a different Bud Fletcher than the one who ran the day shift. Not softer exactly, less compact. He would occasionally speak about the timber, about how the industry was changing, about what the South Fork had been like in the years before he got there, when the river drives had been a different kind of operation, involving many more men and many more miles of river, and a way of life that was already passing when he arrived. He had watched a lot of things pass. He did not lament them. He noted them and moved on. There was one evening in early July, about 2 weeks before the incident at the boom, that I return to sometimes when I'm thinking about that summer. Wayne and I had eaten dinner and taken our coffee out to the flat above the river, which was our usual evening practice when the weather was good, and we sat on the grass with the river below us and the last of the light in the sky above the ridge to the west, and we talked about nothing in particular for a while. Wayne talked about a girl in Roseburg He was thinking about whether she would still be interested when the season ended and he went back. I talked about whether I wanted to stay on the South Fork through the spring or move to a drier operation for the winter. That kind of talk, the talk of men in their early 20s who have the freedom to make plans without yet having acquired the things that complicate plans. At some point, Wayne went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet, and after a minute he said he had a question but wasn't sure it was a reasonable question. I told him to go ahead. He said, "Do you ever feel like this valley is watching you?" "Not in a bad way," he said quickly, "just watching, like there's an attention to it." I said yes. I said I had felt that since my first week on the South Fork 3 years before, and that I had come to think of it as a quality of the drainage rather than something in my head. Some places have it and some places don't. The South Fork had it more than most. Wayne nodded in the way of a man whose private suspicion has just been given company. He said he'd mentioned it to his father over the phone from the Powers payphone, and his father had told him he was spending too much time alone in the woods. Wayne said his father had never worked timber and didn't understand that you were never actually alone in the woods. That was the whole point. You were never alone in a place like this, and that the not aloneness was not always a comfortable thing to sit with. I said, I thought that was right. And we finished our coffee and went inside, and I didn't think about the conversation again until after the events of that July, when it came back to me as something that had been a preparation without knowing it was one. Earl Sanderson was cut from different material than the rest of us. Earl had a systematic mind and a systematic approach to the work that was impressive to watch, but occasionally exhausting to work alongside, because Earl believed in talking through the plan before executing it in a way that Jilly found baffling and I found useful about half the time. Earl would stand at the edge of the boom and look at the configuration of logs and describe out loud what he intended to do and in what order, as if narrating for an audience that included himself. Jilly's response to this practice was to walk away to a different section of the boom and get on with the day's work. My response was usually to listen for about 30 seconds, determine that Earl's analysis was correct, and say, "Sounds right, let's go." We were an effective team in spite of ourselves. Earl had a wife and 2 daughters in Reedsport and drove the hour and a half each way every other Friday to see them, returning Sunday night. He talked about them regularly, the daughters especially. The older one, who was 9, had developed an interest in horses that Earl was navigating with the mixed feelings of a man who understood what horses cost and loved his daughter enough to consider spending the money anyway. The younger one was 6 and had recently learned to read and was reportedly reading everything she could get her hands on, including the ingredient labels on food packages. Earl said she had asked him what maltodextrin was, and he had not known, and this had bothered him more than he expected. He was a man who liked to know the answers to questions his daughters asked. For the first 5 weeks of that summer, the work was hard and rhythmic and satisfying in the particular way that physical labor is satisfying when your body is 21 and built for it. Up at 5, breakfast in the cookhouse where the cook had biscuits and sausage gravy on the table by 5:15 and would not apologize to anyone who showed up late. Down to the river by 6 when the light was still gray and the fog was sitting on the water so thick you could barely see from one end of the boom to the other. We worked through until noon, ate the lunches the cook packed in metal pails, worked again until the light started going around 6 or 7, ate dinner in the cookhouse, played cards or read or sat on the bunkhouse steps listening to the creek until the generator cut off at 10. The rhythm of it becomes its own kind of music after a while. You stop thinking about it and just move. The anomalies started about a week before the incident at the boom. I want to be precise about the order of things because the order matters for understanding what was happening. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. The South Fork drainage was never silent. There were birds in those trees from before first light, varied thrushes, dark-eyed juncos, the occasional pair of pileated woodpeckers working on a dead snag somewhere up the ridge, and a great horned owl that had a territory near camp that you could hear most evenings once the generator cut off. There was the river itself, which on the South Fork has a specific voice, a mid-range rush over cobble that becomes a deeper rumble over the larger boulders upstream, different from other rivers I'd worked in a way I couldn't fully explain but could always identify. And there were the Roosevelt elk. A good-sized herd moved through that drainage periodically, using the river corridor as a travel route between the high summer range and the lowland brush. And when they were present, you heard them. The heavy footfalls, the occasional bugling, even in summer when bulls were still running together, the sound of antlers raking brush on a hillside that seemed too far away to carry. The quiet I'm describing was the absence of all of that. Not a reduction, not the ordinary afternoon lull that comes when the birds settle and the wind drops, a cessation. On the evening of the third day before the incident, I walked out to the edge of the flat where we'd hung a hand pump for washing up before dinner, and I stood there for probably 3 minutes before I realized I was not hearing anything beyond the river and the generator. No birds, no elk movement, no owl. The trees above the camp were dark and still, no wind to explain it. The forest had that feeling of hell breath that I associated with approaching storms, but the sky to the west over the ridge was clear, the kind of pale gold that the South Fork gets on summer evenings when the light comes down the valley at a low angle and turns everything the color of old oak. I mentioned it to Wayne that night in the bunkhouse. He said he'd noticed it too that afternoon when he was working the downstream end of the boom. Said it had come over him like a change in air pressure, and he'd looked up at the ridge line on the east side of the valley without knowing why. The way you look up when you feel watched from a particular direction. He said he hadn't seen anything up there, but he'd felt the looking. I said probably a bear had wandered through the upper end of the drainage and pushed everything off their usual patterns. Wayne said probably. Neither of us mentioned it again that night, but I noticed he left his bunkhouse window latched instead of the usual inch of air. He kept it open for the night smell of the forest. The next 2 days the quiet persisted in patches, not constant. The birds would be present in the morning, and then around midday they'd drop off, and the afternoon would have that blanketed feeling, and by dark the owl would usually be back. Whatever was creating the disturbance was moving through the area during the middle part of the day and absent in the evenings. Bears, in my experience, are most active at dawn and dusk, less so midday, and a bear large enough to put a whole drainage on alert would be a significant animal. I had seen big bears in those hills. What I was clocking was different from a big bear's passage. A bear moves through and the forest settles back within half an hour. Whatever was in that drainage during the midday hours of that week, the forest stayed on edge for the rest of the afternoon each time. There was one other thing before the morning of the incident. On the evening 2 days before, Jilly came in from the boom about an hour after the rest of us. This was unusual because Jilly was always first in, first washed up, first at the dinner table. He sat at the far end of the bench in the cookhouse and ate without looking at anyone, which was not unusual for Jilly, who was a quiet man by nature. But after dinner, when we were on the porch in the last light, he stood against the railing and looked downstream for a long time and then said, without any particular emphasis, that something had been watching him from the far bank most of the afternoon. Earl asked what kind of something. Jilly said he couldn't put a name to it. He said it had stayed back in the alders on the far bank, in the shade, and he'd caught movement 3 or 4 times that didn't match anything he could put a name to. He said at one point it had made a sound. He paused there. Earl asked what kind of sound. Jilly said it was low, said it was the kind of low that you feel in the back of your teeth before you actually hear it with your ears. He said it lasted about 4 or 5 seconds and then stopped, and after that the watching continued, but there was no more sound. None of us responded to this in any dramatic way. Men who work in deep timber learn to set observations down without drama, because the alternative is spending your whole career frightened, and fear is the thing that gets you killed in this work. You see a track you don't recognize, you note it. You hear a sound you can't identify, you note it. You don't chase it down immediately. You don't panic, you file it and you keep watching. That's the only practical approach when your work takes you to places where the forest is always going to know more than you do. And most of the things that live in it are bigger than you are. So we heard Jilly out and we nodded and we went to bed. But I lay awake for a while that night. The river ran outside the bunkhouse window the way it always did, that constant mid-range voice over the cobble. The generator was off, the owl was calling from somewhere up the creek drainage to the north, the familiar sequence of 4 notes that I had stopped registering consciously weeks before. I lay there and I listened to all of it, and I thought about Jilly's description of movement in the alders and the low sound that came up through your teeth and the patches of midday quiet that were too thorough to be anything I already knew how to explain. I did not sleep particularly well. I want to describe that week more carefully than I have so far because the details matter and because the way they accumulated, each one individually explicable and the whole of them together not explicable at all, is the thing that prepared me, without my knowing I was being prepared, for what I would find at the upstream corner of the boom. The first day of quiet was a Thursday. I know this because the previous Tuesday had been the 4th of July, which the camp marked with no particular ceremony other than Fletcher Dodd producing a chocolate cake at dinner that was significantly better than the occasion required, and I measured the intervening days by the work schedule. The quiet came in the mid-afternoon around 2 o'clock while I was working the middle section of the boom with Wayne. Wayne was on a section of logs about 30 feet from me, and I heard him stop his pole work, which I noticed because the rhythm of his pole on the water was a consistent background sound to my own work, and its absence registered the way any absence registers when you've stopped expecting it. I looked over. He was standing still on his logs looking up at the canopy on the east ridge. I looked at the canopy too. There was no movement in the crown, no wind to account for the silence. The birds had simply stopped. Not gone, quiet gradually, the way birds will when something moves through the canopy and disrupts them one section at a time, all at once. One moment the thrushes and juncos and the distant knocking of the woodpecker, and then nothing. A silence that was almost textured, almost physical, like a new pressure on the ears. It lasted 11 minutes by my watch. Then, starting from somewhere north of camp and moving south, the bird sound returned in a wave. The thrushes first, then the juncos, then, right at the end of the sequence, the woodpecker, as if whatever had silenced them had moved south and cleared each territory in turn. Wayne and I did not discuss it that afternoon. We went back to work without comment, as men in that profession handle things that don't need to be examined immediately, which is most things. But that evening I watched the ridge more than I usually did, and I noticed that Jilly, who had been on the downstream section all afternoon, ate his dinner without his usual first-to-the-table efficiency. He was the last one in from the boom. He did not say why. The second day of anomaly was the Saturday 2 days later. This one involved the elk. The Roosevelt elk herd that used that section of the South Fork drainage had been moving through on a predictable schedule that I had observed over 3 seasons. They came down from the high summer range approximately every 10 days, using the river corridor for water and for the mineral lick that existed at a bank exposure about 2 miles upstream from the boom. They were large animals, the Roosevelt being the heaviest elk subspecies in North America, and their passage through the valley was not subtle. You heard the vegetation give way, you heard the water when they crossed, and if the herd was large enough and the wind was wrong, you smelled them. A healthy bull Roosevelt elk in July carries a scent that you do not mistake for anything else. What happened Saturday morning was that the elk came down the valley and then stopped. Not at the mineral lick, not at the river. They came to within about half a mile of camp, which was close enough that I could hear them in the brush on the east bank, and then they stopped moving. A herd that size does not stop moving without reason. They mill, they backtrack, they push into whatever brush is available on the uphill side. Over the course of about 45 minutes, I watched from the boom as the sound of their movement shifted from downstream to upstream, and eventually the sounds faded as they retreated back up the valley the way they had come. The herd reversed course and left without coming to the water. In 3 seasons on that river, I had never seen the elk reverse course without visible provocation. I had seen them scatter from a cougar once in the spring of '73, and that had been sudden and loud and directional, the whole herd moving fast in one direction with no milling around. This was different. This was a large, calm herd making a collective decision to not be where they had been planning to be, with no obvious cause. Earl noticed it too. He mentioned it at lunch, said the elk had turned around up the valley, and he thought that was unusual. I agreed it was unusual. Earl said probably a bear had moved in near the mineral lick and the herd was giving it room. This was a reasonable explanation. I accepted it outwardly, though a part of me did not, but I did not have a better one to offer, so I filed it alongside the Thursday quiet and let it sit. The night before the incident, the night of July 10th, I got up at approximately 2 in the morning and went outside. I am not a man who typically does this. I sleep well in camp. The physical work and the river air and the 10 o'clock generator cutoff conspire to put me down hard and keep me down until the 5 o'clock bell. But something woke me that night, and I cannot tell you precisely what it was. Not a sound or not a sound I could consciously identify. More like the cessation of a background hum I had not realized I was registering until it stopped, which is a strange thing to describe because I still don't know what the hum would have been. I woke in the dark with the clear knowledge that I was not going to sleep again immediately, and I put on my jacket and my boots and went out the back door. The camp was dark, generator off since 10, the security light by the cookhouse throwing its usual yellow circle, the river below the flat running in its usual register, the mid-range voice over the cobble that I had stopped consciously hearing years ago. The sky above the valley was clear and full of stars, the Milky Way visible as a brush stroke overhead between the dark ridge lines on both sides. It was a good night, the kind of Coos County July night that reminds you why people lived in these valleys before anyone thought to log them. I walked to the edge of the flat and stood there for a while. The flat where our camp sat was maybe 60 feet above the river at that point, a bench cut into the hillside by some prehistoric action of the water, and from the edge of it, on a clear night, you could see downstream for about 200 yards before the river bent west and disappeared into the timber. The alders on the far bank were a dark mass against the stars. The water below caught enough starlight to show its surface. I stood there and I breathed and I listened. I was not looking for anything specific. I was doing what I sometimes did in those years when my mind was working on a problem it had not yet formulated. I was being outside and still and available to whatever the night had to offer. What it offered was a smell, very faint, at the edge of detectability, in the kind of faint that a distant smoke fire has when the wind shifts just enough to carry it, a warm, musky animal smell that was not bear and was not elk and was not any of the other animals whose scent signatures I knew from those hills. I turned my head trying to locate the direction of it and could not. It was too diffuse. Whatever was producing it was either moving or simply present everywhere in the immediate area in equal measure, the way a smell distributes itself from a source that has been in one place long enough for the scent to saturate the surrounding air. I stood there with that smell for probably 5 minutes, then it faded, or the wind shifted, or whatever was producing it moved on. The air went back to river and bark and the specific green cool smell of the old growth timber on the ridges above. I went back inside and lay on my bunk and listened to Wayne's breathing and thought about nothing in particular, and I was asleep within 20 minutes. The next morning was the morning of July 11th. The morning of July 11th, 1974 was clear. unusual for the South Fork, which held its morning fog well past 8 o'clock even in summer. But that morning the sky was open, the light coming down into the valley early and sharp, and the river had a particular blue-green clarity that it only got when the water was low and settled and the July sun had been on it for a few weeks. I was in my waders by 6:15 and out on the boom not long after, and the first thing I registered was the smell. Boom men learn smell the way dock workers learn tide. The water of the South Fork had its own particular odor. Cold minerality, bark tannins, the occasional seep of boat diesel, the particular sweetness of wet Douglas fir heartwood when a fresh log came in off the river. I knew that smell so well I had stopped registering it consciously, the way you stop hearing the clock in a room you live in. What I was registering that morning was something laid over the top of the familiar smell, something that didn't belong to the river. It was musky, deep and animal and warm in a way that seemed wrong for the water, which even in July ran cold enough that you felt it through your waders. It had a quality I can only describe as large. Not a word you'd normally attach to a smell, but that's the most accurate thing I have for it. It suggested mass. It suggested something in the water, or very near the water, that was alive and significant. I stood on the downstream boomstick for a moment and I turned my head trying to track it, but it was ambient coming from upstream, general rather than directional. I didn't see what was causing it for another 20 minutes, and those 20 minutes are worth describing because they are how the log boom works and why what happened was possible. The boom that summer was roughly 140 feet long on the downstream side, anchored to the bank on both ends with chain and cable with boomsticks, heavy butt logs 4 feet or more in diameter chained end to end, forming the perimeter. Inside that perimeter were maybe 1,000 logs floating loose, packed fairly tight in the middle where the timber had congregated overnight, looser on the edges where the river current worked through the chain gaps. The upstream end had a gap in the boom sticks where new logs entered off the river. We called it the mouth. I was working the east side that morning, moving from log to log toward the upstream end to push some of the night's incoming timber down into the main pack. The South Fork had been running a little higher than usual that week after a warm spell in the mountains accelerated the snowmelt, and when the river ran high, the incoming logs came in faster and hit the upstream corner harder, which meant they jammed more often. Toward the upstream corner where the boom sticks turned toward the mouth, there was a section where a half-dozen logs had piled up at an angle, pushed together hard enough to wedge into a pocket against the boomstick and the bank. This was common. You'd work your way out there, break the jam apart with the pike pole, free the logs back into the main pack. I'd done it 100 times. I came around the end of the upstream boomstick and pushed out onto the leading edge of the jam, and I stopped. Between the jam logs and the base of the bank, in a space maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet long that the logs hadn't quite managed to fill, there was something in the water. It was holding itself to the bank with both hands gripping the exposed root mass of a Douglas fir that had grown out over the river and dropped its roots down the bank face. The roots made a kind of natural cage, and those hands were wrapped around 2 of the root strands, the way you grip the rungs of a ladder if you'd been hanging from them long enough that your shoulders were burning. The head was at the surface, the body below, and the face was turned up toward the light in a way that told me it had been there long enough to be in real trouble. It was covered in dark hair. The color was deep chestnut, almost black where it was wet, dense and close lying across the shoulders and arms, and the face beneath it was simultaneously the most alien and the most recognizable thing I had ever seen. Broad, flat nose, a brow ridge heavy enough to cast a shadow across the eyes beneath it, a jaw that was wider than any human jaw by a significant measure. But the eyes, when they found me standing on the log above it, had an expression in them that I did not need any training to read. It was looking at me the way anything looks at the one person who might be able to help it. It was young. I say young because size was the only metric I had for that assessment in the moment, and relative to what I would see later that same night, this one was small. Small is a relative term here. The hands gripping the roots were each larger than both of mine combined. The head was the size of a large melon, maybe larger, but the proportions throughout, the roundness of the skull, the relative size of the eyes and the face, something about the way it held its body that I can only call unfinished, all read young to me in the same instinctive way that a young bear reads young even before you've seen its mother. There was a quality of development still in progress about it. The limbs had the mass, but not yet the full density of an adult. The smell was coming off it in waves. That heavy, warm, musky odor I'd caught when I first stepped onto the boom, concentrated now to its source. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of a living thing, a large and warm-blooded living thing that had been in cold water too long and was working hard to stay at the surface. I stood on that log for a moment and I ran through the situation with the practical part of my brain, which in that kind of work never fully shuts off. The jam logs had come in overnight and shifted with the river, and somewhere in that movement the gap between the bank and the outer logs had opened enough for this young one to get in, and then closed enough to trap it. The roots were the only thing keeping it from being pushed under. Its arms were at an angle that told me they had been in this position for a long time, and I could see even through the hair on its forearms the tremor that comes with extended effort past the point of comfort. The fingers on those roots were white-knuckled, or as close to white-knuckled as that coloring allowed. I did not think through what I was about to do in any deliberate way. I did not weigh options. There was a young living being in trouble in my boom, and it had been there long enough that it was losing its grip, and the pike pole in my hand was the right tool for the problem, and so that is what I did. I used the hook end of the pike pole to catch the nearest jam log along its top edge and pulled it toward me. The log turned in the water and I pulled it further, rotating it away from the bank. A second log followed the first, floating back into the main pack. The gap between the bank and the remaining logs opened up, maybe 3 more feet than it had been, but it was enough. What happened next took about 8 seconds. The young one released the roots, turned itself in the water and pulled along the bank and the gap I'd opened until it reached the end of the boomstick. The boomstick was chained at the surface, but there was clearance at water level. It went under, came up on the far side, and was moving through the shallow margin of the river toward the alder fringe on the far bank before I had fully processed what had just happened. It didn't look back, not once. It hit the alder fringe and was gone, and the alders moved and then stopped moving, and the river was just the river again. I stood on the jam log for probably 5 minutes, not doing anything in particular, just standing there with the pike pole in my hands and the smell of it still on the water and the very specific feeling of a man who has just done an irreversible thing without quite deciding to. Then I went back to work. I wanted to take the rescue itself apart a little more carefully because what happened in those 8 seconds tells you something that I think matters, and it has taken me many years to understand exactly what it tells you. When I came around the end of the upstream boomstick and pushed out onto the jam and stopped, I had maybe a quarter second of incomprehension. The brain, when it encounters something outside its established categories, goes through a brief sorting process that is almost audible if you are paying attention to your own cognition. It cycles through what this could be, what shelf it belongs on, and when it cannot find a shelf, it produces a particular blankness that people often mistake for calm. I was not calm in that quarter second. I was just processing. Then the processing resolved, and what I had in front of me was simply a problem. A living thing in the water in trouble, and I had the tool in my hand to address the problem. The rest of it, the implications, the impossibility, the catalog of things this couldn't be, all of that stood patiently to the side while I worked. I was 21 years old, and I had been trained for 2.5 seasons to respond to problems on the water with tools and judgment rather than with reflection or alarm. That training served us both very well that morning. The jam had 3 primary logs and 4 secondary ones. The 3 primary logs were the ones doing most of the work of pinning the gap closed. A large Douglas fir butt end that had come in heavy and fast and driven itself hard against the bank, a Port Orford cedar on its downstream side that had swung sideways and locked against the fir, and a third log, a sugar pine that must have come from further up in the watershed because sugar pine was unusual in that drainage, wedged across the tops of both at an angle that was holding the whole stack in place. The four secondary logs were just floating in the area, caught in the back eddy behind the jam, and they would sort themselves out once the primary jam broke. I started with the cedar. It was the weakest link in the stack because one end was free, floating about 2 feet off the bank, and the other was pinned only by the sugar pine, above it pressing down. I put the hook of my pike pole on the free end and pulled it toward me and rotated it downstream. The sugar pine above it dropped a few inches and found a new equilibrium. The fir butt end, with the cedar's pressure relieved from its downstream side, shifted a few inches toward the bank. That was not what I wanted. I put the spike end on the fir and pushed it away from the bank, and it resisted and then gave, and the gap opened 3 feet, maybe a little more, and the young one moved. What I remember about those 8 seconds is the coordination of it. The hands released the roots not all at once, but in sequence, the left releasing before the right, which then shifted grip and released, and the body came off the bank and turned in the water with a smoothness that spoke to genuine physical control. It moved along the bank in the gap using hand-over-hand pulls on the submerged bank edge, not swimming exactly, but using the water as an assist for lateral movement, and when it reached the end of the boomstick, it went under the chain gap in a motion that was efficient and practiced looking, as if this was not the first water obstacle it had negotiated in exactly this way. Up on the far side, 5 steps through the shallows into the alders, 8 seconds. Every second of it was controlled. That is the thing I have returned to most often in the 50 years since. A young one that was frightened, that had been holding on for hours in cold water with its muscles failing, that had every biological reason to thrash and panic when the gap opened. That young one moved through the gap with composure and economy and was gone before I had taken a second breath. That kind of composure under stress is not instinct. Instinct produces panic. Composure is learned. Composure is taught. The smell lingered after it was gone, that warm, musky, specific smell, concentrated at the bank where it had been holding on, distributed across the surface of the water in the gap, and I stood on the jam log and breathed it for 5 minutes while I processed what had just happened. There is a particular quality to the aftermath of a moment like that when you are alone. No one to turn to and verify that what you saw was what you saw. No face to read for confirmation or disbelief. Just you and the already closed evidence and the necessity of deciding what to do with it. I had that quality of aloneness very thoroughly for those 5 minutes. The boom around me was indifferent. The river was indifferent. The alders on the far bank were still and showed nothing. I could have imagined the whole thing, and no one would ever have known otherwise, including eventually me. I did not imagine it. I knew that with the certainty that lies below the level of argument. The smell was still on the water. The roots where the hands had been were stripped of bark in 2 parallel lines, the mark of fingers gripping hard enough to remove the outer layer from the wood. I touched one of those stripped lines with my free hand and felt the raw, pale wood beneath, and felt, along with everything else I was feeling, the specific sensation of something that has moved from inference to evidence. The afternoon that followed the morning is worth describing because of what it felt like from the inside. I went back to the middle section of the boom and worked my half of the day's sorting, and my hands did what my hands always did: hook, pull, push, bounce, step, hook again, and my mind was somewhere else entirely. It was turning over every facet of what I had seen with the focus and slightly obsessive attention that the mind gives to things it cannot file and cannot discard. The face, the hands, the size, the composure, the way it went under the chain gap, the smell, the stripped bark on the roots, the particular intelligence in the eyes in those 2 or 3 seconds when we were at the same height and looking at each other directly. Wayne noticed I was somewhere else. He came over to me around 3 in the afternoon under the pretense of checking a log I just positioned, which did not need checking, and he said quietly, "You all right?" I said, yes. He looked at me for a moment and said, you sure? I said I was. He went back to his section. He did not ask again, which was the right call. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen for the rest of that morning. Not Wayne, not Earl, not Jilly. I worked through to noon, ate my lunch on the downstream boomstick without much appetite, and spent the afternoon turning over what I'd seen in my head like a man turns over a strange rock, examining each face of it without committing to any interpretation. What I had seen was not a black bear. It was not any animal I had a name for. It was in the water and had been using its hands separately, independently, with the kind of grip differentiation you only see in animals that use their hands with real precision. The face was wrong for a bear in every possible way. The hair pattern was wrong. The proportion of limbs to body was wrong for any primate I'd encountered in a book or a zoo, and the size of it, even young, even small relative to what I'd see later, was wrong for anything I was supposed to find in that river on a Tuesday morning in July. I knew the stories, of course. Everyone who spent time in that kind of country knew the stories. Men who worked the deep timber of the Cascades and the Klamath Mountains had been coming back with them for as long as there had been men working the deep timber. The coastal tribes of the Coos and Coquille people had their own accounts going back further than any written record, and if you spent enough time in the Buckhorn Tavern in Powers on a Friday night, you'd eventually hear something from some old faller or skidder operator that you weren't sure what to do with. I had always filed those stories in the same drawer I filed stories about unusual weather and rogue waves. Interesting, possibly partially true in some attenuated way, mostly the product of tired men in dark country and the human tendency to reach for the most dramatic explanation when the ordinary ones run out. The young one I had freed from my boom did not fit in that drawer. It was too specific. The hands on the roots were too specific. The expression in those eyes was too specific. A frightened animal does not look at you with appeal. That is a human expression, or something so close to human that the distinction stops mattering when you're standing 3 feet above it on a floating log in the middle of a river. At dinner that evening, Jilly looked at me across the table with that particular flat attention that observant quiet men use when they know an event occurred and are waiting for you to decide whether to speak. I didn't speak. Jilly went back to his food. Wayne was talking to Earl about a poker game in Bunkhouse 2, and neither of them had been near the upstream corner of the boom that morning. After dinner, I walked out to the edge of the flat above the river and stood where I'd stood 2 evenings before when the quiet had first pressed down. The light was going, the generator was running, the distant mechanical heartbeat of the camp behind me, and in front of me the river ran gray and dark between its banks. The alders on the far bank were black shapes against a sky that was still faintly pale at the horizon. Above them the dark mass of the ridge timber. I smelled it before I was fully aware I was smelling it, that same deep, warm, musky odor from the morning, but not from the river, from the trees, from somewhere up the bank and into the timber on our side back from the flat, up where the bench gave way to steeper ground and the second growth fir closed in thick. The smell was not concentrated in one spot. It was ambient, the way a smell gets when whatever is producing it is moving rather than stationary. I went inside. I ate half a piece of pie the cook had left on the counter. I went to the bunkhouse and told Wayne I was turning in early, and I lay on my bunk in the dark and listened to the camp sounds and thought about the morning and the smell and the particular intelligence in those eyes. I fell asleep somewhere around 9 o'clock. What woke me at 11:47, and I remember checking my watch by the window light, was not a sound. It was the absence of one. The generator cut off at 10 every night. After 10, what you had were the ambient sounds of a camp full of sleeping men. An occasional cough from down the bunkhouse, the blue tick hound, one of the yarder crew, kept in a kennel behind the cookhouse doing his usual running commentary on whatever occupied his thoughts in the dark. Crickets along the river margin, the river itself. And what came down from the ridge, usually the great horned owl, reliable as a clock, 4 notes, and then silence, and then 4 notes again from a different position as he worked his territory. The owl was not calling. The crickets along the river had gone quiet. and the hound, a dog named Perkins that belonged to a faller named Roy Estes, and that had an opinion about everything from raccoons to wind shifts, was not making a single sound. Perkins's silence was what pulled me up out of sleep. I sat up. Wayne's bunk was across from mine, and in the faint gray light from the window I could see his outline sitting up too, which told me he'd woken the same way I had. I got up and went to the window. The camp was in darkness except for the security light on a pole outside the cookhouse, which ran off a separate battery setup and stayed on all night. It threw a yellow circle across the ground between the cookhouse and the equipment barn and left everything outside that circle in shadow. The horses in the corral by the barn were not standing in their usual positions. On a normal night, the 3 horses the company kept for occasional use around camp stood loose in the corral, spread out, relaxed in that loose-limbed posture horses take when nothing is asking anything of them. All 3 of them were pressed against the far fence, the north fence, as far from the south side as they could get, without going through the wood. They were not moving. They were pressed against it the way horses press into a corner when something is in the pen with them, but nothing was in the pen. They were pressing away from whatever was outside the pen on the south side, which was toward the river. I turned from the window. Wayne was standing behind me, and he had put his boots on. I had not heard him do that. He said quietly, "What is it?" I said I didn't know. He leaned past me to look at the corral, and his breathing changed. I pulled my boots on and my jacket. Wayne did the same. I picked up the flashlight from the peg on the wall above my bunkmate headboard, and then I set it back down, because I suddenly understood that turning on a light was not the right thing to do. Whatever was on the south side of that corral was between us and the river, and I did not want to announce our position before I understood what we were dealing with. Wayne seemed to arrive at the same conclusion on his own because he didn't touch his own light. We went out the back door of the bunkhouse, which opened onto a narrow gap between the bunkhouse wall and the wood pile stacked along the south wall of the building. We stopped there and listened. The camp was absolutely quiet. No generator, no owl, no crickets, no dog. The only sound was the river, which ran about 60 feet from where we were standing down the bank below the flat. The south side of the corral had a clearing between it and the riverbank, maybe 30 feet of flat ground, dry summer grass, and then the drop-off to the water. On the far side of that clearing, at the edge of the drop-off, there was a figure standing. It was upright. It was facing the camp. It was very large. Large doesn't quite communicate what I'm describing, and I want to be careful here because the tendency is to reach for comparisons that are bigger than the truth, and the truth does not need any help. I am 5 feet 11 inches. That figure was to me roughly as I am to a 10-year-old child. The shoulders were wide enough that my first reading of the silhouette was that I was looking at 2 people standing very close together before the single outline resolved, and I understood it was one. The arms were long, hanging to approximately mid-thigh. The head sat directly on the shoulders without an appreciable neck, which gave the whole figure a forward-leaning quality even when it was standing straight. In the faint overflow of the cookhouse security light, the hair covering it read as black, though I would later understand from the young one in the boom that the base color was probably that same deep chestnut. It was standing absolutely still, not the stillness of something unaware of your presence, the stillness of something that knows exactly where you are and is choosing its next action with deliberation. There is a difference between those 2 stillnesses, and you learn it in the field, usually watching deer and bears. But the principle applies here too. Every living thing that is hunting looks different from every living thing that is deciding. Wayne put his hand on my arm and gripped it. I didn't move. The figure stood at that drop-off for what I estimate was 3 to 4 minutes, though in that state of attention it could have been longer. During that time, it turned its head slowly. I could track the movement as a shift in the silhouette, and it scanned the camp methodically, not randomly. From the equipment barn on the left, across to the cookhouse in the middle, to the bunkhouses on the right, with a pause at each structure. When it got to the bunkhouses and paused there, I felt certain it was aware we were standing in the gap between the bunkhouse wall and the woodpile, and I felt equally certain that this awareness was not incidental to the scan. It had found us. It was considering us. It had come looking. The thing I want to be careful about is this. What I felt standing there was not primarily fear, though fear was present. Anyone who tells you they watched something that size stand 40 feet away in the dark and felt nothing was either not actually watching or has a very different nervous system than mine. What was present alongside the fear and what was actually stronger than the fear was a recognition of intelligence in the encounter. This was not an animal in the blundering sense. This was a being that had made a decision to come to our camp, had assessed the perimeter, had identified the positions of each structure and the people in them, and was now standing at the edge of the flat in a position it had chosen. Not closer, not further, exactly where it had decided to stand. And it was not making a sound. That was perhaps the most striking aspect of those first minutes. Something that size, standing on summer dry gravel and grass at the riverbank, produced nothing I could hear. Perkins was probably 30 feet away in his kennel behind the cookhouse, and Perkins, who barked at moths on the window screen, was not making a single sound. My breathing was steady. Wayne's grip on my arm had not loosened. Across the flat, the figure moved for the first time since I'd spotted it, not toward us. It turned a slow, deliberate pivot and looked back toward the river, toward the alders on the far bank, toward the upstream direction where the boom sat in the dark. Then it turned back toward camp, and it made a sound. I have spent 50 years searching for a comparison to that sound, and I have not found one that fully satisfies me. The closest I can come is this. Imagine the sound a big diesel engine makes when it starts, that initial deep throb before the revolutions climb, but stretch it out and make it variable in pitch, rising and falling over 8 or 10 seconds, and remove the mechanical quality so that it's entirely organic, entirely alive. A chest tone low enough that I felt it in my sternum and in the seat of my jaw, and I believe in the fluid of my inner ears, though that last part I cannot prove. It rolled across the flat and through the camp, and I felt it as much as heard it, and I have never received a more direct communication from a living being in any language, in any context, in 71 years on this earth. I knew with the kind of knowing that doesn't pass through the thinking part of the brain first what it was saying. I had freed his young one from the boom that morning. He had tracked the young one's path back to our camp, or tracked the smell of our camp from the place where the young one had gone into the water, or followed some chain of evidence I can only partially reconstruct. He had come not to attack. If attack had been the intention, there would have been no standing at the perimeter. He had come to assess, to see what we were and what threat we posed. That sound was not rage, though I understand why the story gives that impression. It was a reckoning. A father coming to the place where his child had been in danger, standing in the dark to look at it and deciding what to do about what he found. I made a decision without talking to Wayne. I stepped out from between the bunkhouse wall and the woodpile, and I walked to the middle of the flat. I have thought about this decision many times, and I still cannot fully account for it in any rational sense. It was not bravado, and it was not stupidity, though I imagine it looked like both to Wayne, who told me years later he had stopped breathing entirely when I stepped out from the woodpile gap. What it was, as best I can reconstruct it from 50 years' distance, was a recognition that the being standing at the edge of that flat had made its own deliberate choice to stand there rather than come through the camp, and that this choice deserved to be met with something equivalent. He had come to assess and not to harm, and I walked out so that he could complete his assessment with accurate information, which was me, standing in the open, not armed, not threatening, not hiding. I stopped about 20 feet from the woodpile, in the middle of the flat where the weak overflow of the cookhouse security light was just enough to define my shape without fully illuminating me. I stood there. I put my hands at my sides. I did not call out or make any sound. I just stood. The figure at the river's edge looked at me for a long time. The head adjusted slightly, just a degree or two the way you adjust when you're trying to see something more clearly. The attention that I had felt as a physical pressure since stepping out of the woodpile gap settled into something more specific. We stood there, the two of us, on that flat above the South Fork of the Coquille River in the middle of a July night in 1974, and we looked at each other across 30 or 40 feet of dry summer grass. I do not know exactly how long that lasted, long enough that my eyes had fully adjusted to the darkness and I could see him more clearly than during those first minutes. The sheer mass of him was resolved now into specific shape, the width of the shoulders, the length of the arms, the slight forward lean of the head, the density of dark hair across the chest and upper arms that I could distinguish from the surrounding darkness because it absorbed the faint ambient light differently. I could not see the face with any detail at the distance we were at. I could see the shape of it, the brow line, the set of the jaw, and I could see that it was still. What he saw when he looked at me, I cannot say with any confidence. A young man in a wool jacket with his hands at his sides and no weapon, standing in the middle of the place where his child had been in danger that morning and choosing to be visible rather than hidden. I hope that was enough information. I believe it was. He made one more sound, shorter than the first, maybe 3 seconds, lower in pitch, if that was possible, and then he turned and he walked back to the river's edge and he went down the bank in a way that produced nothing I could hear, and the water moved and then settled, and after 30 seconds, the cricket sound came back from the river margin and then from further upstream, spreading out in the way it does when whatever silenced it has moved on. Perkins started barking. One sharp burst, 5 or 6 barks, and then silence again, and then the normal running commentary he kept up through the night. I walked back to the bunkhouse. Wayne was standing in the doorway, and in the thin light from a crescent moon that had risen while we were out there, his face had a quality I can only describe as reorganized, like a man who has taken several large and conflicting pieces of information and is in the process of fitting them together into a shape that will hold. He said, in a voice that was as flat and controlled as I have heard a voice be, "What did you do today that you didn't tell me about?" I told him all of it, the jam logs, the hands on the roots, the 8 seconds of movement through the gap and into the alders. He sat down on his bunk and listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he sat quietly for about a minute and then said, in a tone that contained both disbelief and total belief at the same time, "And you didn't tell Bud?" I said no. He said, "Are you going to?" I thought about it. I said, "I didn't think so." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because the young one was gone and the father was gone, and anything I said to Bud would require either lying about what I'd seen or telling the truth about it, and the truth about it was going to generate a response from the company and possibly from people further up the chain than a camp foreman on the South Fork, and I did not want any of that attention reaching that river valley." Wayne sat with this for a while, then he said, "Yeah," and he lay back and pulled his blanket up, and we didn't talk any more about it that night. The bunkhouse conversation after I told Wayne was one of the strangest I have had in my life, and I have had some strange ones. The strange part was not what was said, it was what was not said. Wayne listened to all of it, the jam logs, the hands on the roots, the expression in the eyes, the 8 seconds, the stripped bark, and when I finished, he sat on his bunk with his hands between his knees, and he was quiet for a long time. Not processing quiet, a deeper quiet than that, the quiet of someone who is not surprised. I said, "You're not surprised." He said, "I don't know what I am." He said, "I've been thinking about that first big quiet on the Thursday, the one that came over the whole drainage." He said he had gone back to the bunkhouse that evening and written about it in the small journal he kept, which I had not known about, and he had written that the silence felt intentional. Not the silence of something absent, but the silence of something attending. He said he had thought about that word since then, attending. And now, here we were. I asked him what he thought we should do. He said, "What do you mean, do?" I said, "About the father who may or may not be somewhere in this drainage right now looking for his young one and following the scent trail back to this camp." Wayne was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "Maybe we just behave like decent people and see what happens." I said, "That seemed about right." He said, "And we don't go running our mouths to the rest of the crew." I said, "Agreed." And we shook on it, which seems ridiculous now and seemed like exactly the right thing at the time, and we went to sleep, or I went to sleep. What woke me at 11:47 I have already described. What I have not described is what the 3 hours between falling asleep and waking up were like, because they had a quality even in sleep. I dreamed of the river, not in the way that you dream of familiar places with the soft distortion that dreams apply to real geography. I dreamed of the South Fork with a clarity that was almost oppressive, every rock in the streambed visible, every variation in the current visible, the specific blue-green of the water under July's sun, visible and accurate, the smell of the tannins and the cold minerality of the water present in the dream in a way that smells usually are not present in dreams. And in the dream, I was on the boom working my usual section, and everything was normal, and the birds were normal, and the elk were normal, but I knew, with the particular dream knowledge that operates below the level of conscious reasoning, that something in the water upstream of the boom was moving toward me. Not the young one, something larger, moving slowly, not urgently, in the deep water along the far bank, and it would arrive at the boom in whatever the dream's version of time was, and whatever it was, it knew I was there. I woke before it arrived. 11:47. The 3 minutes before I went outside, standing at the window watching the horses, were among the most alert 3 minutes I had ever spent. The horses were the thing that organized everything else. You can tell yourself that a silence in the forest has an ordinary explanation, that birds go quiet for reasons you don't understand, and that this is fine. You cannot easily tell yourself that 3 horses in a corral, animals that have spent months in this camp and have made peace with every sound and smell it produces, are pressing against a fence in the dark for a reason you don't understand, and that this is fine. The horses were not fine. Whatever was on the south side of that corral was real, and it was close, and it had the horses in a state that told me everything the silence had only implied. Wayne's breathing behind me was short, not panicked, controlled, the way you control your breathing when you are scared and know that being controlled about it is the right call. He touched my arm when I reached for the flashlight, and I understood without words what the touch meant, not the light. I set it back. In the gap between the bunkhouse wall and the woodpile, which was maybe 4 feet wide and smelled of split alder and the slightly moldy bark of the pieces at the bottom of the stack, we stood for what felt like a long time before the figure became clear to me at the river's edge. The security light was not enough to illuminate that far, and the crescent moon that I did not know had risen was behind the ridge, not yet clearing it, so the light available was the ambient starlight of a clear Oregon July night, which in that valley was just enough to read shapes against shapes without reading detail. The figure at the drop-off was a shape against the lighter shape of the river behind it, and it was sufficient. What I want to describe, and what is hard to describe without having it sound either more dramatic or less dramatic than it was, is the sense I had during those minutes of being in the presence of something ancient, not old as in aged, ancient as in preceding, as in belonging to a timeline that ran behind and beneath the one I inhabited, that had been running long before anyone in my family or anyone in my country's history had thought to put a name on this valley or a road alongside this river. The size of the figure was part of this. The silence of it was part of this. The methodical scan of the camp, the assessment, the choosing of a position and holding it, there was nothing desperate or reactive in any of it. There was a completeness to its presence that felt geological. It was here because it had decided to be here, and the decision had been made with a deliberateness that required no hurry. When it made the sound, I felt it in a part of my body that I cannot anatomically locate precisely. Sternum, yes. Inner ears, yes. But also something lower, somewhere in the solar plexus, a resonance that I associated afterward with what people describe when they talk about a sound that you feel in the ground. Except it was not the ground, it was me. The sound moved through me the way a wave moves through water. not by moving the water itself, but by moving through it, using it as a medium. And what it communicated, not in words, not in anything that parses into language, was presence. I am here. I have been here. I know where you are. I know what happened this morning. I stepped out from the woodpile gap. Those 20 feet across the flat were the longest 20 feet I have ever walked. Fear was there, but fear was not what made those 20 feet long. What made them long was the heaviness of the choice in them. I had decided, with very little time for deliberation, to be visible rather than hidden, to trust rather than protect, to walk toward rather than away from. Each step was a commitment to that choice. Each step said, I mean you no harm, and I believe you mean me no harm, and I am willing to demonstrate both of these things with my body in the open space between us. I do not think of myself as a brave person. I am practical, occasionally stubborn, frequently unwilling to be seen as less capable than I am. None of those qualities are the same as brave, but there are moments in a life when the thing that is required of you and the thing you can do align perfectly, and you do it because the moment is clear and your hands are free, and it would be wrong to do otherwise, with no courage summoned, no decision made, just the body moving toward the obvious right thing. That is what those 20 feet were, not bravery, clarity. I stopped in the middle of the flat, and I put my hands at my sides, and I looked at the figure at the river's edge, and it looked at me. The details I have already described. What I want to add is the quality of the attention coming from the far side of that 40 feet of grass. It was not the attention of something sizing up a target. It was not threat assessment in the animal sense, the kind of focused, acute attention a predator gives to potential prey. It was closer to the attention a person gives to a document they are reading very carefully. Complete, unhurried, methodical. It was reading me. It was taking in everything about my posture, my position, my stillness, my emptiness of anything that looked like a weapon, and it was doing the work that it had come to do, which was to understand what had happened that morning and what kind of being had been present for it. The second sound was shorter and lower. It had a completeness to it, a sense of conclusion that the first sound had not had. The first sound was a question being asked. The second was something closer to a statement. I do not know what the statement was in any language I could translate, but I felt it land in the same place the first sound had landed, that anatomically inexact center of the chest, and what it delivered was not hostility. It was something that I have spent 50 years trying to name and have only come close to naming by saying acknowledgement, not gratitude, not forgiveness, because nothing had needed forgiving. Just acknowledgement. I see you. I know what you did. I understand what you are. Then he left. The manner of the leaving I have described, the turn, the descent, the water moving and then not moving. What I have not described is that I stood in the middle of that flat for probably another 2 minutes after he was gone. I was not frozen or shocked. I was simply not ready to walk back inside yet, because what had just happened needed a moment to settle into me without interruption, and the middle of that flat, with the river below and the stars above and the complete and final silence of everything that had been silenced by his presence, was the right place to let it settle. Wayne was in the bunkhouse doorway when I came back. His face in the moonlight, and the crescent had cleared the east ridge by then, coming in low and thin, was a face reorganizing. He had watched. Whatever he had seen from the doorway was working on him the same way the full encounter had worked on me. And he was in the middle of that work. He let me walk past him into the bunkhouse without speaking until I sat on my bunk. Then he said, "What did you do today that you didn't tell me about?" After I told him, we stayed in the bunkhouse talking quietly for about an hour. Not about the father, about the young one, about the hands on the roots and the expression in the eyes and the 8 seconds through the gap. Wayne said, "It trusted you, just like that. You pulled the log and it moved." He said it the way you say a thing that surprises you by being true. I said, "Or it had run out of other options." Wayne said, "Maybe, but it went the right direction. It didn't go under the boomstick into the main body. It went along the bank to the far side. It went through the gap you made." He said, "It read the situation and it used what you gave it. I said, I thought that was right. Wayne was quiet for a minute. Then he said, what do you think is happening in those mountains that we don't know about? I said, I didn't know. He said, I think a lot. I think a lot is happening up there that we don't know about. And then he lay back and was quiet, and I lay back and was quiet. And after a while, we were both asleep. I slept maybe 3 hours. When I got up at 5, the generator was running and the cookhouse was lit and the camp was doing what camps do in the morning, which is groan and clatter and smell like coffee, and nobody is quite themselves yet, but their bodies know what to do. I went to breakfast and I ate, and I went to the boom. The upstream corner where the jam had been was clear. The logs had redistributed overnight the way they always did, and there was no physical evidence of the previous morning except the scratched bark on the root face of the bank fir where the hands had gripped, and I looked at it once and then looked away and went to work. Gilly worked the upstream end alongside me that morning. Around 10 o'clock, when we were both out near the mouth of the boom, he said, without looking at me, that he had heard that sound in the night from inside the bunkhouse. I said, what sound? He gave me a look that said he considered this the least convincing response he'd heard from me in our acquaintance, and he said, the low one. That comes up through the floor. I said I'd heard it too. He nodded and went back to his log. That was the entirety of the conversation. There is one more detail from the morning of the incident that I want to put in the record because it has stayed with me as clearly as anything else from that day, and in some ways more clearly. When I stood on the jam log above the young one and used the pike pole to open the gap, there was a moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, while I was rotating the first log and before the gap opened enough to matter, where our eyes were level. I was standing on the log, maybe 4 feet above the water, and his head was at the surface, so we were at roughly the same height, and we were looking at each other. I have described this as the young one having an expression of appeal. That is accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. What I saw in that face in those 2 or 3 seconds was a being that was making a clear-eyed assessment of the situation. It was in trouble, and it knew it was in trouble, and it was looking at me with the clear-eyed calculation you use on something when you are trying to determine whether it is going to help or make things worse. It was not the look of a panicked animal. Panic closes the eyes and drives the body to thrash, and this one was still. It was watching me work the log and tracking what I was doing with the exact attention of a being that understood leverage and force and the relationship between the position of the log and the space it needed to get through. I don't know what to do with that observation. In a scientific sense, I never knew what to do with it, but I know what I saw in those eyes, and it is one of the clearest pieces of evidence I have for the intelligence of these beings, clearer even than the father's behavior that night, because the father was an adult doing an adult thing, which was assessing threat. The young one in the water was doing something harder. It was sitting still in a bad situation and trusting a stranger to fix it. I have never been able to think about that without a kind of humility that I do not find anywhere else in the story. I have thought many times about what Gilly knew and when he knew it. He was a man who had spent close to 30 years working the rivers and drainages of Coos County, and whatever the forest had shown him in those years, he had decided long ago that some things are best held in a particular way, not spoken of freely, not denied either, just held. I never asked him directly about any of it, and he never offered, but there was a kind of understanding between us after that morning on the boom, an acknowledgment in the way he looked at me sometimes that said, I know what happened, and I know what you did, and I think you handled it correctly. For Gilly, that was an extended conversation. In the weeks that followed the events of that July, the South Fork drainage gradually returned to its normal character. The birds came back in their usual patterns. Perkins settled into his usual commentary on the dark. The Roosevelt elk moved through twice more before the operation moved that fall, and we heard them and then didn't. The work continued, and the rhythm of it closed over the disturbance the way river water closes over anything that falls in. I watched the alders on the far bank, especially in the late afternoons when the light came down at a low angle and made the shadows between the trees deep and specific. 3 times during those remaining weeks of the summer, I saw movement in those alders that I could not attribute to deer or bear or anything I had a ready name for. Movement that was upright, movement that covered ground in a way that did not suggest the 4-footed gait of anything I knew. Once on an evening in early August, I caught a shape that was large and dark stepping back into the tree shadow about 30 yards back from the bank, and I stood on the boomstick and watched the spot for 5 minutes before moving on. I didn't feel watched in any threatening way. I want to be clear about that distinction because the feeling of being observed by something that is assessing you as a potential threat and the feeling of being watched by something that is simply keeping track of you are different experiences. And I know the difference from my years in that country. What I felt on the boom that August was the second thing. I was being observed. The terms of the observation had been established on the night I stood in the flat with my hands at my sides, and those terms were this. I had shown what I was, and what I was had been assessed and found to fall below whatever threshold would have required a different response. He had come to understand who was in that camp. He had found his answer and made his determination, and the watching that continued through the remainder of that summer was not threat assessment. It was something quieter, curiosity maybe, or the ongoing maintenance of an understanding, the understanding being that I knew where they were and they knew where I was, and as long as that stayed clear, we had an arrangement that didn't require further negotiation. The weeks that remained of that summer unfolded in a way that I can only describe as different in texture from everything before. Not dramatic, not populated with additional incidents of the magnitude of the boom of the night at the flat, but altered. The drainage had a quality to it that it had not had before, or perhaps it had always had that quality, and I had not been reading it correctly until that week taught me the right language. The distinction between those two possibilities has never fully resolved for me. Earl noticed something in late July and did not know what to do with it. He came to me on a Thursday morning with the deliberate expression he wore when he had decided to raise an issue that he was not certain he wanted to raise, and he said, "You see any tracks down by the intake?" The water intake was a small pump setup about 50 yards upstream from the boom, pulling river water for camp use. Earl said he had been down there the afternoon before to check the screen, and there were prints in the mud around the base of the pump housing that he could not identify. I asked him what kind of prints. He said, big, barefoot, human-shaped but big. He said he had measured the longest one against his size 12 boot, and it was half again as long. He said there were 3 of them, maybe 4, pressed into the mud that had accumulated against the base of the housing. He said the weight implied by the depth of the impressions was significant. I asked him what he thought they were. He said, I don't know. He said, I thought maybe a man, some backcountry hiker or trapper who came down to the river and happened to be barefoot, but the size is wrong. He said, I thought maybe I was misreading the mud. I said, maybe. He said, what do you think? I said, I thought there were things in these drainages that we didn't have good explanations for, and that some of those things were large, and that I had been working this particular drainage for 3 years and had stopped trying to explain everything I observed. Earl looked at me for a moment, and then he said, okay, and he walked back to his section of the boom. He did not go back to look at the tracks again, as far as I know, and he never mentioned them again. That was Earl's way of handling what I think he suspected. He put it down and he walked away from it. I do not criticize him for that. Different men have different ways of managing the knowledge that the world is larger than the maps they carry of it, and Earl's way was to not look at the tracks a second time. It was a valid choice. There was an afternoon in the second week of August that I think about sometimes. I was working the east side of the boom, the section closest to the far bank, and the light was doing its late afternoon thing, coming down the valley at an angle that caught the tops of the alders on the far bank and lit them a pale gold, while the trunks below were in deep shadow. It was the kind of light that makes a forest look specifically itself, as if the light is illuminating not just the trees, but the particular nature of those trees in that place on that day. I was watching the alders without any specific expectation, the way you watch things in your peripheral vision on the water, present to them without focusing, available to movement without looking for it, when something at the edge of the alder fringe moved, not deep in the alders, not at the water's margin, partway back in the shadowed zone between the lit tops and the dark ground where the trunks were thick enough to stand behind and the light was insufficient for detail, a shape upright that passed behind one trunk and did not emerge on the other side. The passage took maybe 3 seconds, unhurried, not fleeing, moving with the specific unhurried quality that I had come to associate with a being that was not afraid of the space it moved through. I stopped working and looked at the spot for a while. The alders showed nothing. The water between us showed nothing. I took up my pike pole and went back to sorting, and I felt on the back of my neck and along my forearms the specific warmth of being watched. Not threat, just attention, just I see you and you see me. And this is what our arrangement has looked like since late July, and there's no reason to change it now. I did not see anything else that summer with that level of clarity. Two more instances of movement in the alders that could have been anything and probably were not. The quality of quiet dropping over the drainage 5 or 6 more times during the midday hours, each time lifting again by late afternoon. And twice, coming back from the boom in the evening in the last light, I caught the smell. That warm, musky, deep smell, brief and definitive, and then gone. Evidence of presence rather than presence itself. An acknowledgement of a different kind. The operation moved north in October. The season on the South Fork ended on a Friday morning, and we spent that day packing equipment and doing the decommission work that ends a season. Winterizing the generator, boarding the windows on the bunkhouses, draining the water lines to the cookhouse. The camp that had been a live and inhabited place at breakfast became, by late afternoon, a set of buildings that had the particular quality of emptied structures everywhere, present but no longer occupied, already beginning the long process of returning to the forest that surrounded them. I made the drive down the South Fork Road in the late afternoon in my truck, which I had brought up at the start of the season and which had sat at the edge of the camp flat for months, with the summer's worth of pine needles accumulating on the hood. I drove slowly the way you drive when you are not in a hurry and you know this particular road and you know it is going to be a while before you are on it again. The river was on my left, close enough to hear through the open window. The alders on the far bank were turning, the leaves going yellow in the manner of alder in fall, and the whole valley had a quality of withdrawal, of pulling back into itself for the season. At the bend about a mile below camp, where the road came closest to the river, and you could see a long upstream stretch of the water, I slowed and stopped and sat in the idling truck for a few minutes. I did not see anything. I did not expect to. I was not there looking. I was there, doing the thing you do at the end of a significant thing, which is a pause. An acknowledgement that an event occurred in this place and you are leaving, and the leaving deserves a moment of attention. I put the truck in gear and drove out of the valley. The return the following May at the start of the 1975 season was one of the stranger experiences of that period. I had spent the winter working at my father's shop, relearning the engine repair trade he had been trying to teach me since I was 12, and the shop had been a good counter to what I had been carrying since July. The noise of it, the ordinariness of it, the completely human scale of the problems it presented. A fuel line that needed clearing, a carburetor that needed rebuilding, work that was precise and bounded and finished when it was finished. I had needed that, but by April I was restless in a specific way, and the restlessness was directional. The South Fork was pulling at me in a way that I can only describe as a kind of north finding. A compass needle doesn't choose its direction, it just aligns, and I was aligning with the South Fork the way I always had. The first morning back on the boom, I stood on the downstream stick in the 5:30 light with my pike pole, and I breathed in the South Fork smell, cold water, bark tannins, the first Douglas fir logs of the new season, and something settled in my chest that had been slightly unsettled all winter. Not just the satisfaction of returning to work I was good at. More specific than that, I was back in the place where I knew what I was and what the terms of my presence were, and who else shared the space. The drainage that season was quieter than it had been the previous summer, in the ordinary sense. The midday silences did not come as often or as thoroughly. The elk moved through on their regular schedule without reversal. I caught the smell twice in the first month and not at all after that. The alders on the far bank were just alders. Whatever had been present in 1974 in the heightened, attending way it had been present. The father's particular awareness of that stretch of river in that camp had either moved on or settled back into the ordinary background level of presence that I believe had always existed in those drainages and that I simply had not been equipped to perceive before that July. Or perhaps the assessment had been made and concluded and the close attention was no longer necessary. That is the interpretation I find most satisfying, though I cannot prove it. The young one had been found, the camp had been evaluated, the boom man had been identified as not a threat, and the family had returned to whatever larger patterns organized their existence in those mountains. We were noted and filed and no longer a priority. I found that thought, when I arrived at it, quietly satisfying. I left the South Fork drainage when the operation moved north to a new timber sale in October of 1974. We came back the following spring for the season and worked through the summer of 75, and there were no incidents, though the midday quiet would come over the drainage periodically, and I knew enough by then to simply note it and continue working. Jilly and I never discussed it again. Earl and Wayne never knew the full shape of what had happened, though. Wayne knew enough to carry it quietly, and I believe he did. I stayed with the Coos County boom operations through the early 1980s, working the South Fork, the Middle Fork, and eventually a pond operation near Myrtle Point when the company installed a mechanical sorting deck. By around 1982, the boom man work as I had known it was largely done. The industry had mechanized thoroughly enough that walking logs on a river was something you did in a heritage demonstration, not for your paycheck. I married Connie in 1977. She had grown up in Bandon, fishing the Coquille with her father, and she had no illusions about the timber world or the river world or the things that live in the places where those two worlds overlap. When I told her about the boom on our third date, sitting in a booth at a diner in Myrtle Point over coffee and lemon pie, she listened the way she has listened to everything in the 47 years since, with complete attention and a quality of stillness that tells you your words are landing somewhere that will hold them. When I finished, she said, "Do you think about it often?" I said, "Most days." She said, "Good." She said it the way you say it about a thing worth carrying, not a burden, a weight that has meaning. She never suggested I was wrong about what I'd seen. She never offered an alternative explanation or the kind of gentle reframing that people use when they want to help you believe something more comfortable. She asked precise questions about the eyes, about the hands, about the sound at the edge of the flat, and she nodded at the answers in a way that told me she was filing them accurately alongside whatever she already understood about the country she had grown up in. We raised 3 children, and the children grew up hearing the South Fork story the way other families grow up hearing about a grandfather's particular adventure or the flood year that reshaped the farm. Not a myth, a family fact. Our oldest, a daughter named Joyce, asked me when she was about 12 whether I was afraid when I walked out onto the flat. I told her I was afraid, but I was also certain. And she thought about this for a while and said she thought that was the same thing as being brave. I don't know if I'd use that word for it, but I remember her saying it. I retired from the timber work in earnest in 1984 when my knees told me they had done what they were willing to do on a river, and I went to work for the county roads department, which was easier on everything except the boredom. Connie and I settled in Myrtle Point, 30 miles downstream from where all of it happened, and we have been there ever since. The years between the summer of 1974 and the evening I told Connie about the boom, 3 years, from July of that year to the third date in October of 77, were years in which I lived with the knowledge the way you live with a physical characteristic you have not yet decided how to account for. Not a secret in the sense of something shameful or private, more like a fact about yourself that doesn't fit neatly into ordinary conversation and that you have learned to carry without announcing. I told no one this was not a difficult decision. It was not a decision at all, really, in the sense of something I weighed and chose. It was simply the obvious outcome of the situation. What would I say and to whom, and what did I expect them to do with it? The men I worked alongside in the timber and on the boom were practical men who dealt in observable and repeatable phenomena, and while many of them had the kinds of experiences in deep country that they stored without examining, none of them were likely to respond usefully to a direct account of what I had seen in the upstream corner of my boom on a Tuesday morning in July. And my family, my father in the shop, my mother correcting third grade spelling tests, my brother Dennis in the mill, were good people living lives organized around sensible things, and the story I would have been telling them would have made them worry about me rather than about the South Fork. So I did not tell anyone. What I did instead was read. This was partly Jilly's influence. He had been a reader quietly and eclectically, and there were always 3 or 4 paperbacks on the shelf above his bunk at any given time, and he had the habit of leaving finished books in the common areas of the bunkhouse rather than packing them out, which meant there was always something available. What I had absorbed from Jilly's library in 3 seasons was a variety of history and natural science, and one exceptionally strange novel about a man who spent a year living with wolves in the Canadian Arctic that I have thought about many times since. After the summer of '74, I started reading specifically. I went to the Roseburg Public Library, which was on West Harvard Avenue, and had a librarian named Ruth Higgins who had been there since the 1940s and knew where everything was and what it was adjacent to, and I told her I was interested in accounts of unusual wildlife observations in the Pacific Northwest, and she pointed me toward 3 shelves in the natural history section and 1 shelf in the anthropology section and said, probably start there. I spent the winter of '74 and '75 in those shelves, and what I found was not confirmation in any direct scientific sense. There was no monograph that described what I had seen in the upstream corner of my boom, but context. The oral traditions of the Coos and Coquille people, which I found summarized in an anthropology of Southern Oregon coastal tribes, described a being that lived in the forest and the river margins, and that was to be respected rather than provoked, and that had been present in those landscapes since well before European contact. The language was different from the language I would have used, the framework was different, but the entity being described was recognizable to me in a way that a purely mythological creature would not have been. I also found accounts from early timber workers and rivermen in the regional history section that described encounters they had categorized as unusual wildlife sightings, but that, read with my particular knowledge, described a different thing entirely. A foreman on a river drive in the 1890s who reported that his crew had been followed for 2 days by something that moved through the timber on 2 legs and was too large and too quiet to be a man. A trapper in the Coast Range in the 1920s who described finding a campsite in a remote drainage that contained evidence of habitation, fire rings, crude shelters, processed animal bones that did not match any known indigenous activity in that area, and that was surrounded by tracks he could not identify. Accounts that had been written down by practical, unimaginative men who were simply reporting what they observed, filed in the regional history section under headings like unusual incidents and wilderness accounts, and then apparently forgotten. I was not forgotten. I spent a winter building a picture fragment by fragment of something that had been present in these landscapes for longer than any record I could access, and that the people who had been paying attention, the indigenous peoples, the early river workers, the trappers who spent enough time alone in the deep country to see what was there, had known about and accommodated, and in the main chosen not to announce to anyone who was likely to make it complicated. The third date with Connie was at the Myrtle Point Cafe, a diner on Spruce Street that no longer exists. October of 1977. We had met at a county planning meeting in Coquille in August. I was there representing the timber crew's interest in an access road issue. She was there representing a fishing rights concern from Bandon. And we had gone for coffee after and established that we were both the kind of people who found county planning meetings less painful than they should be, which is either a personality flaw or a calling, depending on how you look at it. The first date was dinner in Bandon. The second was a walk on the beach at Cape Arago, which is a state park on a headland above the Pacific about 15 miles south of Coos Bay, and where the wind had been so direct and cold that we had ended up pressed together on a bench, looking out at the ocean just to stay warm, which was as good a way to start a relationship as any I have found. The third date was the Myrtle Point Cafe in October, which meant we were 30 miles up the Coquille from Bandon, which meant we were in the country. Connie understood the country. She had fished the Coquille with her father from the time she could hold a rod, had walked the beaches and the headlands and the river margins of that stretch of the southern Oregon coast for her entire life, and she had the specific quality that people who grow up in genuine wild country sometimes develop, which is the quality of being at ease with not knowing what everything around you is. The forest does not explain itself, and the ocean does not explain itself. And people who grow up alongside them either make peace with that or they leave and go somewhere more legible. Connie had made peace with it. I could tell this about her by the second date, and it mattered to me in a way I found hard to articulate, but that was connected, I understood even then, to the summer of '74 and what I had carried since. I told her over coffee and pie after dinner. Lemon pie, which I remember because I have thought about that evening many times, and the lemon pie is always there. I told her all of it, the week of anomalies, the morning at the boom, the young one through the gap and into the alders, the smell that evening, the night at 11:47, the figure at the drop-off, the sound, the flat, the second sound, the departure. I told it straight, in order, without embellishment. I told it the way I would have told a work incident to a supervisor, and factual, sequenced, with as much specific detail as I could supply. When I finished, she did not say anything for a while. She looked at her coffee cup and she was quiet, and I let the quiet be. Then she said, "How long have you been carrying that alone?" I said, "About 3 years." She said, "3 years is a long time." I said, "It wasn't exactly a burden." She said, "No, but it's a long time to be the only one who knows something." I said, "Yes, it was." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine and said, "I believe you." She did not say, "I believe you," the way people say it when they are trying to be kind about something they find implausible. She said it flatly with the specificity of a statement about observable fact. Then she said, "Tell me about the sound again." And I told her about the sound, and she asked precise questions, and we sat in that diner in Myrtle Point until the owner started turning off the display lights. That meant the kitchen was closing. And then we walked out into the October night, and she said, "You want to drive up the South Fork Road for a while?" I said yes, so we did. We drove the river road in the dark with the windows down and the South Fork running alongside us and the October smell of the valley coming in. Wet alder, cold water, the particular sweetness of the first rains on dry summer ground. And neither of us said anything for most of the drive because neither of us needed to. The valley was doing what the valley did, and we were in it, and Connie had her window all the way down and her face in the air, the way a person faces into a wind they have known all their life, and I drove and thought about the summer of '74 and about this woman in the passenger seat of my truck who had just heard the story I had been carrying for 3 years and had said, "I believe you," and meant it. We have been married 47 years. We have lived in Myrtle Point for most of those years within 30 miles of the stretch of the South Fork where all of it happened. The river runs through all of it, through our marriage, through the raising of our children, through the retirement years and the fishing seasons and the decades of living in this country that we both knew we were not going to leave. The river is the constant. Everything else has changed around it. The timber industry has changed. The roads have changed. The mills have changed and in some cases closed. The forests have changed. The private ground logged over and replanted and logged over again. The public land older and denser in some places and burned in others. The river runs. Our son, a boy named Paul, was born in 1980. He grew up the way children grow up when their father works the river and their mother knows the coast, outdoor by default, comfortable in all weather, with a natural ease in the boat and on the bank that comes from starting young. He did not pursue the timber work. He became an engineer and lives in Portland now, and he has the story but holds it lightly, the way second generation knowledge is sometimes held, present but not personal. Our youngest daughter, Louise, is a nurse in Coos Bay and comes home regularly. She has the version of the South Fork story that her older sister Joyce gave her, which is the version with some of the edges worn off by retelling, but she knows the substance of it. Joyce was the one who asked me at 12 years old whether I was afraid when I walked out onto the flat. I have described her question in my answer already, but what I have not described is what she said after that. She said, I think that's what it means to be good, not to not be afraid, but to be afraid and to still go out and stand there. She said this with the considered seriousness that some 12-year-olds have before the world teaches them to be less sincere, and I did not say anything for a moment. And then I said, I think you might be right. She said, I hope so. I want to be good at things when I'm scared. I said, you will be. And I meant it, and she has been. And that conversation is one of the ones from the years of raising her that I carry with the same kind of care I carry the July of '74. It was not dramatic. It was just true. The county roads work I did from 1984 until I retired was a different relationship with the same country. Instead of the river from the water level, I was on it from the roads above, moving through the valley systems in a truck with the county seal on the door, assessing pavement and drainage and culvert condition and the condition of the guardrails on the curves above the river. The roads in the Coos County interior follow the drainages the way the old logging roads followed them. The only flat ground is along the water, so that is where the roads go. And working those roads gave me a view of the country I had not had before, a broader view, more of the mosaic at once. I noticed things from the roads that I might not have noticed from the water, drainages that went silent when the truck slowed on the grade above, creek crossings where something had been in the water recently, not the evidence you could point to, just the specific quality of disturbed water that settles differently from undisturbed water if you know what you are looking at. One morning in the fall of 1990, on the gravel spur above the Upper South Fork, about 5 miles upstream from our old camp, I stopped the truck on a ridgeline pull-out to check a guardrail post and stood at the edge of the road looking down into the drainage below. The drainage was maybe 300 feet below, the river visible as a thread of silver through the old-growth canopy, and in the old growth below me, moving north along the east bank of the river, in the mid-morning something moved. I watched it for about 4 seconds before the canopy closed over it again. Upright, large, moving through the old growth at a pace that covered ground efficiently, the kind of pace you use when you are not hurrying, but you have somewhere to be. I stood at that guardrail post for a while after it was gone. Then I checked the post, made a note in my maintenance log about the condition of the concrete footing, and drove on. That is what you do. You note it, and you drive on. And you carry it, and it joins the other things you carry, and the sum of them becomes something you know about the world that most people don't know, and knowing it changes the quality of the country around you. Not frightening, not unsettling, just fuller, more accurate, more commensurate with what is actually there. There are years when I think about the South Fork events every week, and years when a month might go by without them surfacing. What pulls them back is usually something simple: the smell of wet Douglas fir after rain, the particular quality of quiet that settles on a drainage when something significant is moving through it, the way the light comes down the Coquille Valley in July at about 6 in the evening, that specific gold that belongs to deep coastal mountains in the late summer. These things pull the memory up as cleanly as if no time has passed at all. What I have thought about most over 50 years is the decision the father made. He could have come through that camp if half of what I understood about his physical capabilities was accurate. He could have done significant damage before anyone in those bunkhouses had their boots on. He did not do that. He stood at the edge of the flat and he made a sound and he watched me walk out to him and he looked at me for a long time and then he made one more sound and he left. Whatever calculation he ran in those minutes, it came out in my favor. I think about what tipped that calculation. I think it was the simplest possible thing. In the morning, I had freed his young one from the boom, not after deliberation, not as a strategic act, not because I had assessed any potential consequences either way. A young living being was in trouble, and I had the right tool in my hand. That was all there was to it, and somehow, through tracking, through whatever sensory capability allowed him to move across 30 yards of dry gravel without producing a sound I could hear, he had connected the man on the flat to the man who had freed his young one from the water. He came to see what kind of people were in that camp. He saw what he needed to see, and he left. And what he found, I believe, was simply this: a man who would help rather than harm when helping was possible. Not a hero, not a visionary, a boom man who pulled a log away from a bank because there was a living thing behind it that needed room to move. The South Fork of the Coquille River still runs through Coos County. The Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, Mardi, which is what the old Siskiyou National Forest became after a management consolidation in 2004, still covers the ridges above those drainages. Most of the private timber ground has been logged over several times since the 1970s, but the public land up in the high country holds stands that are still as dense and dark as anything I worked in those years. People drive in on the forest roads out of Powers and fish the upper stretches for cutthroat trout, and they are occasionally stopped by a quality of quiet that doesn't match the forest they're standing in, and most of them put it down to the altitude or the stillness that comes on hot afternoons in the mountains. I have a different explanation for it. I have had one since July of 1974. Wayne Pruitt left the timber work a few years after I did and went back to Roseburg, where he started a hardware store of his own that I believe is still there. We have stayed in occasional contact, the way men who shared something significant stay in contact without being particularly close. At some point in the late 1990s, maybe 25 years after the events on the South Fork, we had dinner in Roseburg, and after the food was done and the wives had gone to look at something in a shop window, Wayne and I sat across from each other over the last of the coffee, and he said, "Do you ever wonder if the young one made it?" I said, "Yes, I did wonder that." He nodded. He said he thought it probably did. He said he thought a father who showed up at a logging camp in the middle of the night and stood at the edge of the flat making that kind of sound was not the father of a young one that hadn't made it. I told him I thought he was probably right. I should tell you about one more thing that happened in the weeks after the events of that July, because I left it out of the account earlier, and I think it belongs here. About 2 weeks after the night at the flat, on a Sunday when we were not working, I hiked upstream from camp on the East Bank Trail that followed the South Fork about 4 miles before it petered out into deer track and then nothing. I told Bud I was going fishing, which was not entirely untrue since I brought a rod. I was going to look. I wanted to see if I could find anything upstream of the boom that told me where the young one had gone or where any of them moved. I found what I was looking for about a mile and a half up, on the east bank, in a stretch where the trail swung away from the river and then came back. There was a section of sandbar at the river's edge, about 20 feet of clean gravel that the high water of spring had deposited and left exposed. I almost walked past it, then I stopped and went back. In the sand were tracks, 3 sets of them, maybe 4, crossing the bar from the water line to the tree line above the bank. They were fresh enough that the edges were still crisp, made within the last day or two, I estimated. 2 of the sets were large, each print roughly 14 to 16 inches long and 7 or 8 inches across at the ball, pressing 2 inches into the wet sand. One set was smaller, maybe 12 inches, with a stride that was shorter and less even than the others, like something still finding its gait. I stood at the edge of that sandbar for a long time. I did not step onto it. I took one long look, and then I turned and walked back to camp, and I fished the deep pool below the boom on my walk back and caught nothing, and I did not tell anyone what I had seen. The tracks were the young one and its family, I believed then, and I still believe now. The smaller print was the young one moving through on its own, still working out what its legs were capable of. The larger prints were the adults, at least 2 adults flanking it, one on each side of the bar, the same way that adults in any family walk when they have a young one between them in unfamiliar country. They were moving upstream, away from the boom, away from the camp, into the high country. That was the last direct evidence I found of their presence in that stretch of the drainage. Earl Sanderson retired from boom work in the mid-'80s and moved to Coos Bay. I heard from someone in the industry that he lived there until the mid-'90s. I lost track after that. Jilly died in 1989 of a stroke at the camp he had moved to on the upper Siuslaw drainage, which is where he had always said he intended to end up. I heard about it secondhand and did not learn much more. I think about him sometimes when I am on the water. I fish the Coquille occasionally, mostly for steelhead, and I think about what that quiet man carried in his 30 years in the deep timber of Coos County and what he made of all of it, and whether he thought about the night of July 11th the way I think about it. I believe he did. I believe that for men who spend real time in that kind of country, encounters with things they can't name are not the anomaly we tell ourselves they are. They are what happens when you go deep enough into the places that have been there since before the roads, and you pay enough attention to what those places are actually showing you. The thing I understand now that I didn't understand when I was 21 is that what happened that July was not an exception to the normal order of things. It was the normal order of things seen clearly. The South Fork of the Coquille has been running through that valley for a very long time, and the drainages that feed it have been home to things that don't appear on any inventory or species list for a very long time. And on a summer morning in 1974, a young one got trapped in a log boom, and a boom man with a pike pole helped it out. And that night its father came to the camp to understand who had done that. All of it was ordinary in the deepest possible sense of that word. The love of a father for his young one is ordinary. The instinct to help a living thing that is in trouble in front of you is ordinary. The decision to walk out into a dark clearing and let someone who needs to look at you is, if not ordinary, at least available to any person who is paying close enough attention to the moment to know that it's what the moment requires. I am 71 years old. I have told this story to my wife and my children, and now to whoever's listening to this. Connie is sitting in the other room as I tell it, within earshot, and if I get something wrong, she will let me know, which is one of the privileges of 47 years of marriage. The details she would correct are small ones. The substance of it is exactly as I remember it, and my memory of that particular week in July of 1974 is as clear as anything I carry. Go to the South Fork of the Coquille River, take the forest road out of Powers, the one that follows the water upstream into the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. Go in the morning, early before the other vehicles, before the day heats up and the thermals start moving the air. Park at one of the pullouts above the river and stand still for a while and just listen. If the birds go quiet in the middle of the morning for no reason, you can identify, and the Roosevelt elk that have been moving through the brush on the far bank go still, and the only sound left is the river itself. Pay attention to that. Whatever is moving through that drainage in the quiet hours has been moving through it since long before any road was pushed in there. It is not lost. It is not confused. It is exactly where it has always been, living the life it has always lived, raising its young ones in the drainages that the timber companies and the Forest Service and all the rest of us have been treating as simply a place to take timber from. It is not simply a place to take timber from. It is a home. It was a home before it was a timber sale, and it will be a home after the last road has grown back over with alder and salal. The ones who live there know this. They have been patient about it in a way that I find, the older I get, increasingly admirable. On the morning I freed that young one from the boom, I did not think about any of this. I thought about a living thing in trouble and a pike pole in my hands. That was the whole of it, and it turned out to be enough. I hope it was enough. I hope what the Father saw when he stood at the edge of that flat and looked at me across the dark was a man who could be trusted with the knowledge of what lives in those mountains, a man who would see what was in front of him and respond to it honestly rather than with fear or exploitation or the kind of noise that brings other people running. If that's what he saw, I hope I have kept being it for the 50 years since. That is the closest thing to a conclusion I have for this story. A young one got free, and a father came to see who had helped it and found a boom man standing in the dark with his hands at his sides. And then The cricket sound came back from the river, and the morning came and the work went on. It always does. The work always goes on, and the river always runs, and whatever lives in the old timber country of the South Fork of the Coquille goes on living there in the way it has always lived, patient and quiet and very, very good at not being seen by people who aren't paying attention. I was paying attention that July. I am still paying attention now. That is what I have to tell you. That is all of it.